that the greatest Scot is Steve Scott.
Am I getting to you, fellow Earth babies? Greetings and welcome to Post-Punk Heartstrings. I'm Jimmy James S. Butler, and you were just listening to Steve Scott's Wall of Tears. Hello, am I coming through? Hello, am I getting to you? And Steve will get to you because he will be joining us on this episode. This will be part one of our conversation, and I'm so excited for him to be joining us. This will be the second conversation that we have had with Steve, and he was gracious enough to come back for a second time around when we lost the recording of the first interview chat that we had. And if you haven't heard of Steve Scott, then I don't know what to say. You're going to hear a lot. You're going to hear some poetry. You're going to hear spoken word over loops. You're going to hear some fabulous post-punk, new wave, 80s music. And you're going to get lots of stimulating and reflective conversation from Steve. I do want to mention really quickly a couple of things. I would be remiss not to mention Matthew Sweet, who had a stroke sometime last week, and I can very much relate, of course, if you've been listening to me, and I wish him all love, peace, and healing as he embarks on this long road to recovery. I personally feel like Matthew Sweet's music was very underrated in the early 90s, and if you have only heard the few songs of his that happened to make it on the radio in the early 90s, you definitely should go and dig in to his body of work because there are so many beautiful and uplifting and heartfelt tunes on those albums. I also want to give a shout out to the Christian Geek Rockcast. If you've been listening to my show at all, you know that I have spoken about coming out of the Christian culture, and that's what I was raised in, and that was my introduction to a lot of the alternative music in post-punk style. And they have so many great shows. I haven't even been able to listen to them all because it's time-consuming making this show, but there's so much there to mine, and I believe their latest episode is either getting ready to drop or maybe it just dropped just today, is 77 Sticks and Stones, which is just a truly magnificent album. So be sure to tune in, check them out. And again, like I said, there's so much there to mine from that podcast. I've had a little bit of a rough week. It is Friday night. I'm so thankful that my work week is over. I'm still working on my recovery, and when there's a lot of work stimulus, it really taxes my brain and makes it difficult to process cognitively and speak clearly. So I'm not going to be super long with this intro tonight, and you're probably very thankful for that. You're like, yes, finally, the universe has found a way to shut him up and keep him from talking so much. During our lengthy interview, second time around, we were privileged enough to hear several poems by Steve, and he read them towards the end of our conversation. I thought it might be interesting from a creative perspective to intersperse the poems throughout the podcast. So we're going to hear one of the poems now, and then we will jump directly into the first part of our conversation.
I bought a single string of beads in a Marrakesh bazaar. They were blacker than a starless night. I dreamed of binding them upon my wrist, hoping that they would assist my recollection of your many names, and further would provide an anchor or a frame for all the rushing thoughts that hitherto had filled my days with overflowing streams. I got the beads at half the opening price. We both seemed satisfied with our end of the deal. I made my way back to the main square, where the sunlight fell upon the righteous and the rest of us, though these days, who can tell, so many lines seem blurred. Meanwhile, the drums begin their fevered pulse and throb beneath the shrill, insistent reeds that wail as they poke and prod the slack coils on the sackcloth till they stir and stake their regal claim upon the day, spreading their hoods and rising as they sway. From where I stood, their tongues were hidden still, but their eyes were beads that glittered as they asked me, "Is this real?" I'm here.
Wow. Hi, Steve.
Hey there. You can hear me? I can hear you wonderfully.
Wow, it's seamless today. Nothing could go wrong. Famous last words.
Feeling deja vu.
Oops.
Right. Everyone's early, too. That never happens. I would say most of the time when I do this, I'm sitting here and people show up like 5 or 10 minutes late. Like guests that want to talk to me. So this is perfect. So we're good. Recording. I think we're pretty much all set. And we got lots to cover.
Yes, we do.
And you added some stuff, which is great.
I still see a red recording.
You're still there, baby. All right. We'll have fun with it, I think. We'll have a little bit of technological deja vu with going over certain things we already talked about again, but there's no way we're going to catch everything we talked about before, but I think I did a pretty good job of keeping notes and stuff from our last discussion, and we'll leave some stuff out and add new stuff in and just see how it goes. So I'm Jimmy James. I have Steve Scott, a legend, here with me, and I've got Jim Anderson, a younger legend, here with me.
Hello.
And I'm not a legend. I'm just a guy who loves music.
That's not true.
Yeah. So I think last time I started off, I opened up with I just wanted to let you know the first time I heard your music was on the boot level compilation album on Alternative Records from Randy Layton's label. And I had never, I was raised in my teen years listening to the CCM music of the day, also radio, stuff, top 40 stuff. And I had never heard of you. And I got that, I think I sent off a mail order to like maybe True Tunes Records or something like that. And I got that release and I was blown away. I think the 2 tracks on there were Touch and Emotional Tourist.
Okay,
and
good.
Then after that, it was quite a while after that I found the more of your music because it was really hard to find in maybe the early 90s, maybe late 80s.
Sure.
So that's kind of how I heard of you. And I think Jim also, he talked about when he first heard your music as well.
Yeah, it was about 4 years ago. I think I was on the 77's fan club on Facebook, and somebody had mentioned you on there. So I was like, who is this person? So I went down a rabbit hole of finding out about you after that. Love all the music.
It's quite a rabbit hole.
Yes.
Good.
So I mentioned in our previous chat that you
Hmm.
are somewhat of an obscure yet very significant figure in the early Christian alternative music scene, the very fringe music in the CCM world. I hate to even classify it as the CCM world because you guys were just really trying to make artistic music. So, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got into art and music?
Sure. Yeah. I was born in Northeast London, United Kingdom, several years after the end of World War II. Rationing was still in effect. We were in a town or we were in a part of London, no, like Northeast London, Walthamstow, which is famous for a very long street market. It's also famous for having the William Morris Gallery. William Morris was a radical artist and designer in the Victorian era that wanted to bring art and life together through his designs for wallpaper and book covers and things like that. And as a very small child, I made several trips to the William Morris Gallery, and I think it with my mom, and I think it really must have really impressed me. So I went through school, and I was fairly, I had an indifferent education. I wasn't like super smart or anything like that. By the time I came out of high school, and we're talking about the mid to late 1960s, two things happened. One is I enrolled in art school, and the second thing was is that I had um, come into or converted to the Christian faith through an evangelical outreach in the town that we'd moved to, which was Chingford, which was a little 5-minute bus ride down from Walthamstow. So here I am at the beginning of the alternative kind of psychedelic era, going into art school, and I'm a brand new Christian, trying to form both some kind of spirituality and also some sort of idea about how I was meant to be making art or engaging the culture and things like that. And I was trying to figure all this stuff out. So I went through art school, and while I was not a particularly distinguished artist of any kind, somewhat indifferent, average visual artist, I was exposed to a lot of what was, breaking out in the sort of the underground and the experimental and the avant-garde culture of the time from the late 60s through to the mid 70s, which means I went in during the sort of the Pink Floyd era and I came out during the sort of Sex Pistols era. So I was exposed to an awful lot of radical elements and ideas and practices during my tenure at art school. I also, providentially, because of where I ended up doing my 4-year degree, meeting an American musician called Randy Stonehill after seeing him at a concert in a local church. Um, a mutual friend of mine, Steve Turner, a journalist, um, got to introduce him to me properly after I'd seen him in a concert, and I was really amazed. And I was going, oh, this is really good compared to what I'd experienced previously in the name of Christian music in England in the 60s and 70s. I thought Randy Stonehill was like way above, cut above what I'd heard. Musically, lyrically, performance-wise. I got to meet Randy Stonehill, and that was great. And I was writing music at that time, and I got to the circumstances too convoluted to go into here, but I ended up playing some songs for Randy Stonehill. And he and I became buds because we were like living I was living in sort of Norwood. I was going to Croydon Art School, and Randy and some other Americans were renting a house in Carshalton, which was just a little way over on the map. One of his friends was a guy called Larry Norman, and Randy played some of my songs for Larry Norman. Now we're looking at the mid 1970s. I'm coming to the end of my art school career, such as it was. And wondering what's going to happen next. And Larry Norman is talking to me about forming a record label called Solid Rock. And would I like to be considered for being part of that thing? And I said, yes. And so in 1976, I made my first trip over to America and met the likes of Tom Howard, who was working on his album for Larry, and other musicians, Alex McDougall, the percussionist, Randy was there. I was staying with him, and I got to meet a whole bunch of amazing people. So I went back to England and spent a few months wrapping things up, trying to get things boxed up and sorted out and say goodbye to people and things like that. And I came back in 77 with a view to now the conversation about the Steve Scott recording project was, it had legs. It was happening. We were going to do it. So I came back in 1977 and I found myself in the studio not only with the exquisite string arrangements of Tom Howard, but the guitar playing and the production skills of a Mark Hurd. Mark Hurd, who had been recording Appalachian Melody at that point. And so I'm working with Tom Howard, Mark Hurd, an astonishing guitar player called John Lynn, Alex, the percussionist, and a host of others whose names I've forgotten, but they were all stellar people to be working with. I'm going, this is astonishing. It's amazing to be here. It was amazing to be in London at Air Studios while Larry was tracking, I think, Salome Go in the Garden, getting to go to those things. To be here in America, writing these songs, making this record. I thought, great. I'm gonna, put out records. There's this emerging sort of marketplace, as it were, for contemporary Christian music. May be on the fringes of that. Maybe find some way of, sustaining myself, and then I can also check into all the like hardcore art damage stuff that I was really interested. The beatnik bookstores, the galleries, the experimental film screenings and things like that. I thought this is amazing. What an amazing opportunity. I get to write some songs, record with and work with these great people, and I get to go look at some like real art as well. Of course, it didn't work out like that. And the solid rock records began to evaporate a little bit, began to untangle. Some of the things were around Larry and Randy and the other artists. Things began to get loose, a bit convoluted. And here I was, I'm going, oh my gosh, what I thought was parrot. I'm on thin ice here. What's going to happen? Randy had taken me up to Sacramento. He was doing a concert for a church called Warehouse Ministries that was senior pastor Louis Neely and his wife, Mary Neely. He said, come on up and meet these people. So I did. I went to the concert, met these people, we began to talk. And Louis had been an evangelist in India with a standard denomination. Mary had been cultivating a Bible study back here in the Sacramento area, which had blossomed into this church full of countercultural types. And Mary had this great desire to explore, I want Louis as well, of course, to explore the place that the arts could play in, definitely, yes, communicating the gospel, but also, culturally engaging with the larger culture in a sensible and an intelligent way, so that you could create a platform for Christian truth claims, of course. So because what was happening in Southern California began to unravel, the prospect of moving up to Northern California and getting more and more plugged in to what was happening at Warehouse Christian Ministries became a thing. And it became more and more attractive. And it seemed to be like the next thing to do, the next step to take. So that's what I did. So I moved up to Northern California, left an incomplete recording project down south because everything was so kind of scattered. I didn't know what was going to be happening with all that. Um, and then I moved to Northern California to Warehouse Ministries that was exploring poetry, exploring theater, putting up visual art on its walls, um, looking for ways of using the arts to both inform and enrich those already within their walls and engage and communicate to those who were outside their walls with a view to bringing them in. So I thought, this is great. So I got plugged into that. And they were putting on theater, they were doing poetry readings, they were doing this, they're doing that. They eventually put a record together called Come Back Soon, which used one of my songs as like the title track. And this is one of the songs that I originally called it for Larry. Um, they also had a writers' weekend in which they brought up a whole bunch of people from Berkeley. And so suddenly I was meeting, but this move to Northern California not only plugged me into an arts-friendly, culturally engaged church, it also exposed me to a community of Christian thinkers and artists and practitioners who were down there in Berkeley. And I began to develop a relationship with them too, going to poetry readings in the Berkeley area, talking with them, writing for their magazine, which was called Write On. It eventually became Radix. I published an article on the arts through them a couple of times, 2 or 3 different times along the years. But longer story short, Songwriting Productions at Warehouse Christian Ministries morphed into a focus on music, and Exit Records was formed. And Exit Records was formed, and on Exit Records was your Vector, with like the keyboardist and singer and player Charlie Peacock was part of that. He eventually broke out as a solo artist. Bands like First Strike, bands like the 77s. The 77s began as the scratch band, and I was just talking with Mike Rowe only the other day. The scratch band was originally, apparently, formed around the idea of providing a backing band for Steve, which kind of morphed into a band without a catalog. So let's play a bunch of Steve's songs, such as on this Doomed Moving Pictures Larry Norman project. But then as they got up to speed and changed their name from the scratch band of the 77s, there were musical geniuses and writers in that band. Mark Tootle, Mike Rowe, Jan Eric Vols on bass, Mark Harmon later on bass, the drummers, Aaron Smith, Bruce Spencer, and their first drummer, whose name suddenly slips my mind. Mark Proctor. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, there you
Mark
go.
Proctor, yeah. And so suddenly that band began to develop their own catalog of songs and their own distinctive sounds. And the 77s became myth and legend. But they worked with me in various sort of permutations or different configurations of the various musicians that were there, backing me or helping me, especially when it came to making a record for Exit Records. I made a record for Exit Records called Love in the Western World.
Classic.
It might see life again, because the reason I was together with Mike is because we were in a studio where we were trying to take the half-inch safety of this very album and digitize it for the purposes of remastering the project for 21st century ears and 21st century sensibilities. So that is in that sort of thing is bubbling under. But that's how I was in the presence of Mike in the conversation. So I did Love in the Western World for Exit Records. Unfortunately, or fortunately, providentially, I had to leave the country for a few months just around the time that this album came out. So the album came out to the sort of the indifference and the bewilderment of religious publications like Contemporary Christian Music. Some people liked it. I think Cornerstone Magazine published a good review. I think John Trott said some insightful things about it. But I was gone. I was not a touring rock star promoting his album. I was in England, wondering now what's going to happen because
Was that having to do with your visa?
it was we were in process of sorting things out so that I could live in the country. And one of the requirements that they asked, they said, well, while we're processing this bit, we would really like you to go back to England. Um, you can't just like hang out here on a temporary visa. We would prefer it if you went back to England and just waited there till you get the good word from us. So that's fundamentally more or less what happened. Um, so back to England, and as I say, at the time, I mean, I've gone from Larry Norman, Unraveling. Now what? Songray, Warehouse, Exit Records, whole bunch of new relationships, the Berkeley Group, new relationships, wonderful things. Bang, suddenly I'm back in England with, now what am I going to do? But while I was back in England, all sorts of strange things happened. This was like 1983. I I got to see the birthday party with Nick Cave playing at
Yeah.
North London. I think their last gig on their UK tour. And I'm going, I'm sure I'm looking at something quite historical, but this is really frightening. Um, I mean, he was committed, it was loud, and it was visceral and aggressive.
Hmm.
While I spent a month in Cambridge, at a cheap place with a typewriter trying to write a novel. While I was there, I discovered the novels of Shusaku Endo, the Japanese novelist who wrote Silence, that Martin Scorsese turned into a film. Um, so suddenly I'm trying to find every Shusaku Endo book I can find. I get those, I read them. When I eventually do come back into the country, Endo is actually lecturing at Berkeley. I go down, talk to his translator, write an article about Endo for Write On / Radix magazine. And then out of that, this is just following the tangents, I was invited to go teach at a summer school in arts and missions, and then down in Pasadena. And then out of that came, I was given some information about an arts conference in Bali in the late 1980s. And then suddenly I'm in Bali. So I've gone from art school London to Southern California, which is going to answer all my questions, which ends up not doing so. I go to Northern California, and that's going to answer all my questions. Of course, it doesn't. I'm stuck back in England, but I'm seeing Nick Cave in the 80s, and I'm reading Shusaku Endo in the 80s, and writing the songs that ended up being part of Emotional Tourist while stuck in England. But this much to say, somewhat a tangled, convoluted path. As I said last time, 80 to 90% of this is not about the scintillating genius of Steve Scott. It is about all the people who sewed into my life, who invested time, money, provided friendship, spiritual counsel. There's an awful lot of relational dynamic that has unfolded and got me to where I was then in the 80s and to where I am today. And I want, if there's any kind of takeaway from an interview like this, is don't view relationships transactionally and trust the bigger picture.
Yeah, that's great. I'm really glad you mentioned that again because I remember that specifically from our last conversation and the impact of other people on our paths in our lives and our impact on theirs, likewise. And you've mentioned a few times already that you were surrounded by a lot of people that enhanced you and
Sure.
what you're doing. And God's path for us is not necessarily straight, you know,
No.
and our choices are sometimes don't make it straight either, right? So you look at it through a great perspective of just kind of seeing this is where life went, and I'm thankful that I got there or that I'm still going there, you know? So,
Sure, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, well, the path is never straight, and invariably it involves other people that get to play a role, and you get to play a role in whatever is unfolding in their particular narrative. I think we discussed last time, and I had no idea who this guy was, but there's a guy called Jeremy Cowart in the Nashville area who is a sort of a polymath, designer, photographer, and things like that. And I watched a video called "I'm Possible" by Jeremy Cowart many years ago. And in this video, he talks about his schooling, his educational experience, his learning, I don't want to say difficulties, but he was having a somewhat an indifferent experience learning. And somewhere along the way, he discovered he liked art. He began to make art and things like that. And then somewhere within that particular parenthesis, he began to experiment with digital photography, and he built a portfolio and a career as a digital photographer. I think he's won tons of awards or some awards for his work, portraiture, and stuff like that. Well, as he talks about that in the "I'm Possible" video, which is on YouTube, and everyone should go look at it, there briefly flashes up on the screen the image of the person who gave him his first digital camera. And that person is Jimmy Abegg. And
Yeah.
Jimmy Abegg was part of the warehouse scene when a number of the musicians went off to Nashville and things like that. Jimmy went, and Jimmy's been like a guitar player and a abstract painter and a graphic designer, and he's worked with Rocketown Records and things like that. But when I saw that brief image of Jimmy Abegg, while Jeremy Cowart was talking about how someone encouraged him to get into digital photography and gave him a camera, I'm just going, it's amazing the role that we play in someone else's life. And it is
Yeah,
not
absolutely.
something to be taken lightly or ignored. And I was just recently, I'm rereading again the first chapter of the Gospel of John. And for all the highfalutin language that occurs at the beginning of that gospel about the deity of Christ and the Word and all things being created through him and things like that, this, much of the second half of the chapter is taken up with your Phillips, your Andrews, your two followers of John the Baptist who go off because John the Baptist says, "Follow him," pointing to Jesus. And then they start to introduce other people one by one to Jesus in that particular narrative. And Philip eventually goes to Nathaniel at the end of that chapter. I'm just thinking, man, the part we play in bringing significant change into other people's lives, whether we're introducing them to Jesus or we're giving them a digital camera,
Mm-hmm.
or we're just saying something which encourages them to keep walking the path they feel they're meant to be walking. I mean, I do not think we can overestimate the significance of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I mentioned last time that I heard an interview with Mike Rowe, who mentioned how impactful you sharing music with him from Europe and bringing that back over. And, you know, I'm sure that affected his path and the type of music that they were making and went on to make as well.
That would be, I mean, what I was hearing when I was stuck in England for those few months. I was listening to bands like the Joy Division. I was also listening to a band out of Sheffield called Comsat Angels. Uh, and
Great
I
band.
was also listening to a band called the Smiths that was just starting to put stuff out. And I brought some of this back to Michael and played it to him. And we were both big fans of Comsat Angels and the
Mm,
Smiths.
cool. Yeah. And I think you mentioned you were listening to uh, the radio station with Pill on it.
John Peel,
Yeah,
yes.
John Pill.
John Peel was the he was pretty much the go-to guy for stuff that you would want to hear. I first encountered John Peel's broadcasts from a pirate radio station where in the late 60s, where I think it was a late night show he was playing, and a good deal of the stuff that he played was imported West Coast psychedelic bands. So he was playing that. He
Hmm.
would also, once he'd moved to the BBC, he would be introducing different kinds of approaches to reggae music and slightly more hardcore, slightly less diluted sounding premix reggae music from Jamaica. He was uh, responsible for, well, not solely responsible, but he was a champion of, the early punk rock. Um, and Peel had a broad enough sensibility and a deep enough taste and an encyclopedic appreciation of blues music, for example, which served him well in the late 60s. But he was always bringing new things to the table. It was through Peel that I heard The Birthday Party. It was through Peel that I heard the early tracks by Comsat Angels. And there are probably other examples I could dredge up as well, but Peel was basically the sort of the epicenter of a lot of what we were listening to and attracted to. And we're talking about the late 60s through to the mid 70s and beyond.
Can you talk about like your thoughts about the significance of the role of art in what I call the post-punk, new wave, even punk, as it kind of started to merge all together,
Mhm.
and the role of the abstract visuals and experimental soundscapes, in that music?
I can talk about it briefly because my particular exposure to abstract visuals and things like that would be going to early Pink Floyd concerts and seeing liquid light shows with bands like Pink Floyd or Hawkwind or the Third Ear Band or other bands that would be playing local college gigs. I was out of England during a lot of the mid 70s emergence of the punk scene there. When you say post-punk, I am personally aware that I cannot name them all, but there were bands that had something like an art school sensibility. So they were already into the idea of making music or at least using music as a foot in the door, so to speak, to bring in a whole bunch of other artistic practices and sensibilities. When I would go out to a gig, it wasn't just immersive psychedelic liquid light type stuff. Eventually, you'd be seeing bands that would be, there was the term in England at one point, alternative cabaret.
Hmm.
So they'd be doing things that would lean towards the theatrical, lean towards multimedia, but it wasn't so much about immersion. It was more about analyzing and exposing you to the way that media shaped your understanding. I think what I will name, there was a genius guy, sadly no longer with us, and I met him first in 1970 when he was an art student at Bristol. And I got to hang with him a bunch once he'd moved to London and was in a graduate program at the Royal College of Art. This guy was called Steve Fairney. And Steve Fairney and Bev, his wife, they were Ritz, Writz. They were the Technos, the Techno Twins, Casualties. And they brought a very much of a sort of an alternative cabaret art school sensibility to the fact that they also made pop music. And, you know, Steve looked like Charlie Chaplin, so he was on TV a whole bunch. And they did art about popular media that carried both the sort of the artistic critical questions while at the same time being very engaging and appealing at a pop level or at a popular culture level. So that's who I think of as being the sort of, for me, the poster children of someone that brought together that sort of that art damage sensibility with a popular cultural engagement sensibility. But insofar as there was a drift towards a larger post-punk embrace of the theatrical, the embrace of the multimedia, I vaguely recall that often they would be name checking or alluding in their interviews back to early 20th century type stuff. I mean, the classic figure who brought a sort of an art damage sensibility with him into a pop culture environment is David Bowie. You know, he started out as a sort of a singer-songwriter. My understanding is that while he was good at doing that, and I well remember him as the sort of the hippie space oddity guy with the hair and the bell bottoms and things like that. And then he morphed and changed and took on a kind of a sci-fi narrative with Ziggy Stardust, which he'd collaged together out of, again, some sci-fi that he'd read and some people on the fringes of the music scene he knew, and he took aspects of their story and put those things together, created a character, and spun out this new narrative, and then did the same process with the Thin White Duke and things like that. But at every stage, I mean, Bowie evidenced an awareness, a sort of a meta understanding of playing with pop reference in accessible ways that nonetheless drew heavily on his interests in the more avant-garde aspects of the arts.
I'm an alligator. I'm a mama, papa coming for you. I'm a space invader. I'll be a rock and rollin' bitch for you. Keep your mouth shut. Just walking like a big monkey bird. And I'm busting up a brains for the world. Keep your electric on, baby. Put your ray gun to my head. Press your space nose to my love. Freak out in a moon age daydream, oh yeah. Don't fake it, baby. Lay the real thing on me. The Church of Mad Love.
So Bowie as poster child for a lot of what you're talking about. And I am aware from what I've read of interviews and things like that with other bands that integrate visuals, theatrical sensibilities, imagery, things like that, into their work that they were drawing, inspired by Bowie, of course, but also drawing upon early mixed media theatrical experiments from, say, the beginning of the 20th century and late 19th century. That's convoluted. Does that answer your question?
No, that's a great answer. So it sounds like that's like Mary Neely's vision was pretty consistent with that, as far as incorporating art. Maybe not exactly what you're talking about, but it's in that same the same vision, I guess.
Somewhat. I'm going to say, and I learned a lot from my time at Warehouse Christian Ministries about how to talk about art in a way that walks with the people you are talking to. When you start a conversation like that, if you've come out of an art school background or you've come out of an academic environment, you're going to have certain preconceptions about, who you're talking to and what they're going to understand, and never the twain shall meet, sort of thing. But a lot of my particular learning, and it's an ongoing learning, out of Warehouse Christian Ministries, was there are different ways that the conversation about art can be had with a local congregation. And you will learn new ways of listening yourself, as well as new ways of talking yourself, which will suggest that you're actually talking with people as opposed to merely talking at them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a learning process, and it's one I'm still in. But
Yeah.
But the idea of being able to grasp the importance of something, whether as a missionary you've seen what art does in culture, in Asia and things like that, or as an art student, you are aware of the institutional gallery and the academic practices. Either way, coming and just walking within or alongside a group of people that want to know what you think, and you also have to learn to talk in ways that indicates that you have great respect for how they think as well. I'm trying to nuance the conversation in such a way that makes me sound like someone who, invariably we show up with all the answers, and it takes a long time for us to actually climb down from that kind of pretense and that posture to a point where you are a fellow learner. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. Yeah. Very well put. Earlier in the conversation, we kind of got off on sort of a side discussion, and that was great. I think you were in Bali, or maybe you had come back to Sacramento.
Yeah.
And you had made a record with Exit Records,
Yes.
Love in the Western World. Then you went back to England and then to Bali. Is that correct?
The timing went like this. Steve in the late 70s, early 80s, and the 77s. Then we do the album Love in the Western World. Then Steve has to go back to England for a few months while that album comes out. Then Steve is absorbing things in England without realizing that they're going to be part of what he does in the future. Then he eventually comes back to America in the fall of 1984. No, in the beginning of 1984, spring of 1984. And there's talk about doing another record. Exit Records it's got some sort of distribution deal with A&M. And here I no, because I was not part of any of those conversations. Everything I got was kind of like third hand. Then they changed and they got this deal going with Island Records. Steve records all these new songs he wrote while he was stuck in England. I don't think A&M or Island particularly were that overwhelmed by what they heard of Steve's songs. Meanwhile, the article that I'd written on Shusaku Endo had gotten me a teaching gig that summer down in Pasadena for an arts and missions thing, which led to me learning about a conference in Bali, which is where I ended up going. Gotcha. Meanwhile, Steve Scott's relationship with Exit Records is changing because they can't get me arrested, as it were, with the labels they're getting distribution deals with.
Hmm.
So they're going. So eventually, somebody called Randy Layton steps into the picture and says something like, "I've got a record label called Alternative Records. Why did Steve put out the stuff that he recorded for Exit, but we couldn't get out? Why don't we put this stuff out on Alternative Records?" Which we did, and it was called Lost Horizon. In 19, and this came out the same year that I was on the island of Bali,
Okay.
learning all about art, culture, church, relationships, and mission from artists from the Philippines, from Africa, from India, and from Indonesia. My mind was being blown, and I mean, I remember sitting at the airport to get ready to go to Bali. I had hours to kill. Lost Horizon was just out, and a few people had written in for lyric sheets. And I was sending these things off from the airport while waiting to get on a plane to Bali. So if I thought coming from England to America to record with Larry Norman was trippy, sending out lyric sheets from LAX while waiting for my Garuda flight to Bali, that was double trippy. Does
Yeah.
that cover what you were asking?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah, it definitely. And then I appreciate what you said about the emotional tourist album. And I think I mentioned last time that always had like an impression that the album wasn't put out on Island just because they had their hands full with U2 and their album coming out. And I know the 77 self-titled album, they didn't get like a lot of publication because Island didn't know what to do with U2. So I always thought, well, maybe your album didn't get put out on Island because of that. But it sounds like from what you said, you just didn't think they were interested. That's your perspective.
I have never, ever, as much as I would like to believe that it was U2 that cost me my my pressing and distribution deal and rock stardom with Island, I cannot in good conscience
Yeah.
even suggest that. I think someone heard the project and just said, what's this?
Yeah.
Or
And yeah.
or next, or well,
Next.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or we're not going to work with this. It's, he's a nice guy, I guess. But I don't know. It's pretty mundane. I mean, I can think of tons of people that are much better at all this stuff than me, who completely get dropped, get lost in the mix, fall through the cracks. I mean, everyone can think of horror stories, surely, of bands that should have been huge, but were not. Songwriters who were incredibly intelligent and sensitive and melodic and things like that, who should have been household names, but were not. People who suffered, unfortunately, as labels changed hands, things get dropped. I mean, whatever happened between Island, U2, and the 77s is that story, which I can't comment on because I
Yeah.
was present in those conversations.
Yeah.
I think the 77s, it's a safe bet to say that the 77s were probably more rock star ready than, I was. They were much more radio ready, as was Vector.
Yeah.
Charlie Peacock, definitely. And he proved it by going to Nashville and, charging out there and doing all that stuff, producing, putting out his own records, arranging, doing all that stuff. So there, with the 77s and with Vector, there were other bands that were much more like poised and had the goods, who did not launch in the way that, in my opinion, they should have, out of all that stuff. Yeah, even
Gotcha. Yeah.
Comsat Angels. I mean, they're
Yeah.
the band that there's a sort of a cult following for the Comsat Angels. They should have been much huger than they were.
Yeah. I guess there's hundreds of reasons, why these decisions get
Exactly.
made.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stuff happens, and it goes, in my opinion, it goes back to some of what we were talking about earlier when we're talking about big picture thinking and providence and relationships is I don't know. It would be great if if a record had come out and I'd become a household name or somebody else had become a household name and we got rich and famous and gave all our money away to missions organizations and stuff. But it was simply not to be. And I have to believe that there is something about the bigger picture that while it might not have caused that, can definitely do creative things with that, even though to you it's quite frustrating to not be a famous pop star.
Yeah, yeah. And just to be clear for listeners, I have heard the Mike Rowe talk about this time with Island Records, and a lot of 77 fans, I've heard them talk about this, like they're kind of have some, I don't know what the right word is, not animosity, but like some ill feelings about U2 and the Joshua Tree. And Mike Rowe has expressed that it wasn't Island's fault, it wasn't U2's fault, it was just they blew up so big that they just couldn't handle U2 in the promotion, and they couldn't keep up with it. And so it just affected, other bands, and he doesn't have any ill will towards, that time. And I think he probably has, now in hindsight, based on what I've heard him say, he has that bigger picture view as well.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
U2 was bigger than Island Records at the time because Island was a boutique label that was run by Chris Blackwell, okay? It started out as reggae artists and then eventually started having pop hits. Well, when he signed U2, he didn't have any idea that they were going to become as big as they did. So in order to handle the success that was happening with them, the entire Warner Brothers machinery had to be thrown into place. Let's just put it this way. U2 could have sold 10 times the amount of records if they'd been on another label than Island. They were just gone because they all had to vacate their office in order to deal with the U2 thing, right? They were just hanging on for dear life, right? So our little record, our little band, and all the other excess stuff pretty much got, left in the dust because there was just no way. Over the years, people say, well, it's all U2's fault. They did this. U2 didn't hurt us at all. It was that Island couldn't even keep up with their success. Island was just not equipped to deal with big-time success like that. It was a boutique label under the arm of Atco Atlantic Warners. So we couldn't wait for that to end because once it did, that's when Joe Taylor and Gene Eugene called me. And they said, hey, we've got this little label distributed by word. You want to be on it? I went, sure. And that was able to keep our thing going and sell way more records than we had on the Island. So Island was an interesting sort of left turn. And I'm grateful for it because I learned a lot. But ultimately, it would not spell teenage stardom for us. We didn't get to go on the road with U2 or any of those things, which is fine with me.
So you talked about Lost Horizon, which last time we spoke, I expressed that I feel like this is a perfect album, which is really interesting. I know that you had the Emotional Tourists, you had those tracks, you had some EPs. Rice, I think, was in there somewhere.
I cut some tracks under the title of Rice, and it was going to be an EP. But what ended up happening is that we collaged together the tracks I had recorded for Rice, which were songs like What is the Mystery and Shadow, and the slightly more, for me, experimental approaches to songwriting and instrumentation. And we brought those together with some of the songs that were on Emotional Tourist. And we took a couple of tracks out of the original Emotional Tourist lineup. Songs like Heaven Hears the Heart That Breaks and Memory Babe, songs that were written to bring a certain kind of dimension or a color into the Emotional Tourist project that was different to what the other songs were doing. We took out the somewhat lighter stuff and we put in the stuff from Rice, and then suddenly Lost Horizon. We came up with the title Lost Horizon, and here we are. We've got like a kind of a group of songs that seem to be talking about traveling across cultural surfaces. I mean, it
Hmm.
suddenly became, if you like chapter two on From Love in the Western World. Love in the Western World was mining relationships and feelings of alienation here on our home turf. Then Lost Horizon slash Emotional Tourist was pressing into, well, do we become any more real by stepping across boundaries? In some cases we're running away from something. In other cases we're traveling to discover something. Do we end up stuck with the same questions?
Hmm. There's a lot
So
of references to communication.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
can I be heard? The words I can use or hold back, and how that affects
Yes,
relationships.
yes,
Yeah.
all that. Yes, exactly right. On Love in the Western World, like Tower of Babel, which very much went into human relationships and expressive language in some ways. I mean, it sounds really pretentious to talk in these terms, but we just have to live with the fact that I am a really pretentious person.
You are so pretentious. So
Um,
yeah, yeah. So I mentioned that I felt like this is a perfect record. And I also mentioned in the same breath that it's cobbled together, which is really
sure.
interesting to me. And it's very anthemic in my
Yeah,
mind.
sure.
It's very big and bold and arena. The sound is very just in your, I don't know, it's very in your face. You can feel it
Uh,
around you. I just can't say enough good things about this album.
good.
Yeah. So I'll give a general comment. Last time we talked, I asked you how involved you were with the production of the songs and putting them together with instruments, and I believe you told me you were very involved in it. Um,
Somewhat. Let's
so
say
so
somewhat.
now you're saying somewhat.
What
um,
what I mean by that is that I had certain ideas of what I wanted guitars to do and certain kinds of melodic fills and harmonic intervals that I wanted
yeah,
to put in there, and I wanted certain kinds of sounds on the drums and things like that. But I mean, the tracks were produced. They were produced. I mean, just as Love in the Western World was produced by Stephen Souls.
hmm,
A lot of Emotional Tourist and what ended up as Lost Horizon was produced by a Charlie Peacock
yeah,
with a lot of input and a lot of intelligence coming in from people like Steve Griffith and
yeah,
Mike Lowe. I definitely had certain kinds of flavors that I
hmm,
wanted to incorporate and bring out. And they were like, as I say, chord structures or instrumental pads and things like that. But there was a lot of sensible heavy lifting that was done by other people in bringing the tracks, from chaos into something that sounds like music.
So was it fair to say that you were kind of communicating to the different musicians, here's what I want to sound like this, or I want to feel like this, or, you
There
know,
was there was definitely some of that. There was some conversations between me and Mike Rowe,
yeah,
or me and John Flanagan, who was a guitarist I was working with at some point. Gary Landecker was playing bass. Aaron Smith was drumming. They knew what I was looking for. In some cases, I taught or demonstrated parts to people, and
hmm.
they would play them. Yeah, or same with
I think
Aaron.
last time I asked you about No More Parades,
Mhm.
and which has everything you want in this song, including the harmonica. And I asked if that was your
Yeah.
idea to put that in, and you said
Uh,
yes, I think.
yes, I did want the harmonica in there, and I I think we had a session with a harmonica player to play that. And at one point, I was sketching out the harmonica riff using the harmonica patch in a synthesizer. So I knew what I wanted. I mean, I'd used the harmonica before. I mean, I'd used it on Love in the Western World, um, in the coda as we went out from there. And
Hmm.
I think it crops up again in touch somewhere. There's some harmonica. I was really
Yeah, I think
fascinated by
so. Yeah.
particular harmonica sound that I remembered from early Beatles records.
Hmm.
And I
Very
wanted
reminiscent of that.
that sort of nostalgic, melancholy mouth organ sound woven into what was meant to, perhaps meant to be stereotypically something a bit more 80s or new wave or something.
Yeah.
And to throw in a 60s reference via a harmonica riff, that's what sort of thing I wanted to do.
Well, that's very
That's,
Smiths-like too, I believe.
yes.
Yeah, very similar to that.
Well, what the Smiths did and other bands do as well is they just create all these layers,
Hmm.
lyrically, Morrissey's like pulling from different literary figures he's familiar with. Johnny Marr's guitar sound, it sounds like something you've heard before, maybe, but then it's got some very, very distinctive and unique qualities to it. And the Smiths and a bunch of other bands as well, and a bunch of other artists they're doing things that at one level sounds ironic, tongue in cheek.
Hmm. Hmm.
Another
Absolutely.
level is painfully sincere, and then another level it just drives along. It does the job. The drums and the bass and the guitar. It just gets you there. It's the same with the recordings by the Comsat Angels. As you're listening to things, like I'm hearing all these weird chord inversions the guitarist is playing that takes me to a place emotionally. The bass doesn't help because it's all over the place, uh, and really creating these weird structures that you can't quite hang on to. The singer sounds like a small child who's fallen down a well, you know, and
Yeah.
the lyrical
Yeah.
content is all about isolation and emotional damage or relational damage of some kind. And the drums, they record those in an elevator shaft, and they're big and full of resonance and echo, and it's like everything is brought together. And you're thinking, well, I can barely figure out technically what they're doing here, but there's a definite emotional atmosphere that is carried through everything these people are doing, specifically with the Comsat Angels, and with say the Smiths and some other bands and other artists as well. There's that thing which is, part irony, part tongue in cheek, part sad, part melancholy, and that's some of what I was going for myself when I would start throwing in very sort of retro guitar sounds, twangy
Hmm.
guitar sounds, or harmonica riffs and things like that. I'd want those in there to just put a slightly different spin on what was happening in the song as it unfolded.
Yeah, that's great. Do you want to talk a little bit about No More Parades and the lyrical content? I know some of us were jugglers, some of
It's,
us were
it's
clowns.
the verse. Well, I mean, it's a bit like the song "Ship of Fools," which
Yeah,
is on the same project.
yeah.
It's basically a description of, say, like the 1960s,
Mm,
people thinking that they're going to, they juggle things, or they're clowns, or they're going to figure stuff out, or they're suffering, or they've come to the conclusion all this confusion is just an illusion.
yeah.
Um, the lyrics aren't that deep in any kind of deepy kind of way. The chorus, "No More Parades," I mean, it's just like almost like an apocalyptic thing. It's just saying there'll be no more parades for you. Like for all the variety of things that you attempted to do. There was a song I recorded for the Larry Norman album called "The Raft Is Not the Shore," which the verses again go through in that song, and maybe it's unfair to talk about it because the song is not out in any form as yet.
Hmm.
Um, but the verses all dealt with the different kinds of spirituality that people attempt in their quest for reality and truth, with the chorus, never mind your means of travel, for the raft is not the shore. Please don't boast of your arrival till you come in through the door. So there's definitely,
Mm,
the raft is not the shore is a Buddhist proverb, basically saying how
mm.
you got here is not the same as being here. but coming in through the door is a very specifically Christian reference. So that song, which is very unfair to talk about because no one's heard it, but maybe they will at some point.
Yet.
Yeah,
Is that a tease?
we live
Yeah.
in hope. But in the same way, No More Parades was very much about people trying their various options, social, political, spiritual, their attempts to break through to some kind of truth. But there'll be no more parades. No more parades for you. When every flag's in ribbons, darling, and all the glory fades, there'll be no more parades for you.
Some of us were jodelers and some of us were clowns. Some of us walked on wires that were stretched above the ground. Some of us were crusaders and some of us were merely traders, taking life in part exchange just to make the day go round. But there'll be no more parades. There'll be no more parades. No more parades for you. Some stayed in the shadows while others tried to build the thousand walls and bridges that would span the brave new world. Some fought on the front lines while others stayed unattached. They'd come to the conclusion that all this confusion was just an illusion. But there'll be no more parades. There'll be no more parades. No more parades for you. When every flag's in ribbons, darling, and all the glory fades, there'll be no more parades for you.
No More Parades, of course, was a quartet of books about the First World War by Ford Madox Ford. And the First World War was that which inspired a lot of early 20th century, somewhat convulsive and disruptive art movements like Dada and things like that. The conversation being, if this is where truth, beauty, and progress gets us, then why not be ugly and meaningless and fragmentary? Why not take all your ideas of art and civilization and turn them upside down, as the Dada artists
Awesome.
did? And in the same way, in the same way, if all this 60s idealism suddenly turns into corporate fat cat hippies with haircuts, why not blow it all up again via punk rock? I mean, punk rock is neo-Dada, essentially. And try and get things back to basics in that way. So all that to say, even the title No More Parades was a nod towards the somewhat apocalyptic nature of things. And
Cool.
as well as a bunch of verses about people's quest or search for truth.
I think there is a reference in one of the other songs on this project, and I can't remember which song it is off the top of my head right now. But I think you mentioned parade in one of the other songs. I can't remember what it is. Do you recall? I haven't quite picked apart all the lyrics
Okay.
that I have, as I usually do. So
I
because there's
know,
so many.
well, I know there's no more parades. I don't know if there's anything in minor characters that.
It might have been that one. It was down. I think it was in the second half of the project, but
Okay. Well, let me just take a look. See what
But
we
there's a
got.
lot of things you do with recurring themes or references to
Absolutely. Yeah.
of communication and tears and
Sure.
um,
There was Ghost Train. Maybe there was something in Ghost Train that
it might. I don't think it was that one.
uh,
We'll see if we come to
typical
it.
minor characters, the sound of waves. Who knows? What is the
They're
mystery?
hard. You got to find the lyrics are hard to find unless you have the CD in front of you, which I don't even.
Yeah.
I think they're in the CD. I'm not sure.
There was a lyric sheet that I sent out, and in the event he said completely non-committally, the CD gets remastered and gets
Mhm.
reissued in digital download form, then the lyrics will be made available on a Bandcamp page or something adjacent or parallel. Were that to
Gotcha.
happen, and I'm
You
not
mean
suggesting
when?
timing it, but it's about that is in discussion or is about to happen. I'm
Yeah.
just saying.
Yeah.
Maybe
I gotcha.
Kickstarter. So
Now, Jim, don't you have a vinyl copy of Lost Horizon?
no, I have Love in the Western World. I'm not quite
Oh,
sure where it is. I
the
got
vinyl.
records
Yeah.
all over the
Yeah, there's
place.
no vinyl Lost Horizon. There's
Okay. Gotcha.
talk again, rumor, whisper, whatever, of maybe an eventual vinyl of the emotional tourist.
Yeah. I believe I mentioned that last time, but when we weren't recording, when we talked,
Let's
that
talk about that.
there's I think they're working on that project. It's Randy Layton's son.
Matthias,
Um,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and they're working on a release of that. They hope to.
Yeah, they hope to. And as I
Yeah,
said, I'm having some very loose conversations right now about some of these other projects that
yeah,
is need to be born again in our post CD world.
yeah, yeah. Last time talked about what is the mystery,
Mhm.
and you talked to me a little bit about that song. I love that song so much, and I wanted to hear you talk about it again.
Um, I began to write that song during a break in a band rehearsal.
Hmm.
The guys went off to get coffee, and I went over to the keyboard and just began to plunk around, and came up with the chord structure of the verses, which would be like A minor to C to E minor, back to C or something. And then I came up with a chorus sound, at least a chorus chord structure that was different, sufficiently sort of not quite adjacent to what the verses were doing to
Mm-hmm.
to make me interested. Lyrically, I wanted to go for something that this is where the pretentious comes stuff. Minimal, almost like a Japanese haiku.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very minimal, leaving out tons of information, but just trying to suggest that, a single tear, a single word, a moment of silence, all these things can change a relationship or change the world around the relationship. And I remember coming up with the keyboard part, and then when Gary Landaker came back in, I said, I I want to, give me your bass guitar. I said,
Mm-hmm.
and he did. And I figured out this weird, clunky bass line. And I said, this is what I want in this song. And he being a really good bass player, picked it right up and did that. And then we went to big, thunderous guitar chords in a chorus. And even when we were recording it, there was a section where, I mean, the chorus was in like one key, and we were meant to transition to this coda, which was going to be full of echoey guitar and me singing "What is the Mystery?" And the guitarist, who was tracking this, came in with the coda chord, something like 8 bars too soon, or something, or 16 bars too soon,
Hmm.
or some measure too soon. And we all just stood there because the chord that he played, I mean, basically, he was meant to play G major, like a G major triad. It's like 1, 3, and 5. big, crunchy G major track. What he played was D minor, somewhere up the fretboard, and the notes from the D minor just kind of hung there like this radiant cloud over everyone else playing G major on the track. And I thought, that is absolutely amazing. You know, you never imagined that was going to happen in a zillion years. And for me, that shift, the kind of the emotional shift I experienced when I heard a very committed G major chord played by most of the band and a very committed D minor chord played by the lead guitarist. When those things came together, I'm just kind of going, oh, this is astonishing.
Yeah.
Do it again. You know, that kind of.
A single tear splinters the world into patterns, catches 1,000 reflections now. A single word ruins the conversation, freezes the situation now. Look at us now. Why don't you speak to me? Where are the words? What is the mystery? Look at us now. Why don't you speak to me? Let it all go. What is the mystery?
I really feel like the drums are pretty spectacular on this song and the album. Was it Aaron Smith playing?
Yes, Aaron Smith.
It's hard. I was pretty sure it was because his drumming is kind of set apart, you know, in sound. I can usually tell. I think the drumming is very amazing on this album and really lends.
I think I was, again, it's just the bigger picture thing, you know. I think I was very lucky. I was very lucky or very blessed and very fortunate to record with Larry Norman and to have string arrangements by Tom Howard on some songs, production values and guitar playing by Mark Hurd, background vocals by Mark Hurd, John Lynn, astonishing guitar player, all those things on those tracks back then. And then getting involved with Exit Records, being able to work with Mike Raw, Mark Tootle, Gary Landacre, Mark Proctor originally, Aaron Smith, Steve Griffith, John Weber from time to time on keyboards, Bongo Bob Smith on percussion, Charlie Peacock on various keyboard parts and arranging and producing. It's an astonishing blessing to be able to work with people of that caliber who are not only of that caliber in terms of musicianship, but also are able to empathize with the more sensible of your ideas and help bring those things into fruition. They get it and they feel it and they translate it.
One of the other things I wanted to mention about what is the mystery, which you kind of mentioned already, but I think you mentioned it was kind of simplistic as far as the approach of the lyrics, but there's so much deep meaning in just the simplistic, like the little sort of one-liner type, little pieces of a single tear can splinter. Sure. It's almost like affects it's like a prism, like your view of everything. Exactly. Or a single word changes everything, or a single word that is held back changes everything. there's so much to absorb from the lyrics for me.
Good. Yes.
And that is going to wrap it up for the first part of our conversation with Steve Scott. There was just too much to try to fit into one episode. So I invite you to please come back and listen to the second half of our chat and hear some more of the amazing music and poetry. Until then, I want to once again thank all of you who have been here before and come back for more. And hopefully you will be waiting with anticipation for Steve Scott to come back soon. And I leave you now with Steve's track, Come Back Soon. Until next time, peace and love to you all.
Come back soon. Why did you ever have to leave us? I know that you once told us we should never fear, but things are so much different now that you're not here. We tell people you're returning, but no one seems to believe us. Come back soon. We still think of you. Someone found your picture and they put it on the wall. It's the first thing people see when they come into the hall. But some of us were wondering, were you planning on coming back at all? Now we've settled down and reconsidered. Things are much better. We're living out our lives to the rule book, down to the last letter. Things are so much finer, folks are kinder than they ever were. They leave us to our business, which is flourishing more than it ever did before. Come back soon. Nobody really seems to miss you. Some of us are talking about the Third World War. Some of us are saving for that second car. Sometimes when we're by ourselves, we're wondering just where the hell you are. Come back soon. 2,000 years roll by. I guess we never realized it would take this time. But you should see those things some folks are doing in your name. I can't point no finger